Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. The Caribbean Royal Tour, made by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in March, was met with mixed reactions. Villagers protested in Belize, while in Jamaica there were talks of a referendum and demands for an apology and reparations for Britain's role in the slave trade. Is the tide turning for Britain? Is the Commonwealth turning its back on the mother country? And will other Caribbean and African nations follow the path of Trinidad and more recently Barbados and become republics? When the issue of reparations come up, I always wonder whether reparations would really solve anything. We live in a compensation culture where we feel that money will resolve our issues, but what are the issues? Surely it is not about when did slavery happen and to whom, but why slavery still existing today and what can we do to contribute to its complete abolishment. Those who were actual victims of the transatlantic slave trade are long gone and are not here to benefit from such reparations. We today are not the victims of slavery in the way that our forefathers were, but subjected to a system that maintains a status quo of inequality through unconscious bias, and this is what we need to be continually addressing. Educating others to be aware of it, but also continuing to promote and practice our own self-improvement and self-worth. There are countries that are former British colonies who have been able to prosper by training and retaining a skilled labour force and using this to develop their own effective economies, which are not so easily affected or dependent upon aid from foreign influences. Although these countries, and Britain, recognise the atrocities that occurred to its indigenous populations, these countries rarely talk persistently about apologies and reparations. Is talk about reparations a deflection away from a failure to level up and address internal issues? Can reparations ever compensate for a country's internal problems, or is it more about an inward work that needs to be done in order to make progress and move things along? It's probably time for each country in the Commonwealth to reassess its relationship with Britain and its role in the world, but is the Commonwealth going through an evolution of its own anyway? In these present times, we are witnessing the invasion of several European sovereign nations as Russia aims to rebuild its empire, but we are also witnessing the transition of many former British colonies into another empire. As China's influence has been growing, the part of the map of the African continent which used to be distinctly pink now has a more crimson hue. Here we see two contrasting approaches to empire building. One nation is using force, while another is using more subtle and sophisticated means. But both China and Russia have the same aims: to achieve geopolitical influence and soft power across the world. Over the past 2 decades, there has indeed been a new scramble for Africa. Between its 54 sovereign states, it accounts for almost 20% of the world's population, 10% of the world's oil, 90% of the world's platinum, 2/3 magnesium, and half of the world's gold supply. With the not-so-small detail of Africa contributing to nearly a quarter of the world's UN votes, all this makes Africa a big deal and has always been a battleground for the world's superpowers. But will China's approach bring about an occupation of the continent that will promote an era of real growth and prosperity, away from centuries of exploitation and underdevelopment? Looking back in history to the 19th century, what was the attraction of Africa for European nations such as Britain and France? Due to its natural resources and large labour force, over a quarter of the continent came under British control through forced invasion and treaties from as early as the 1840s, after the abolition of slavery in 1833, culminating in the Berlin Conference in 1884, where many European powers staked out their territory across the African continent. We know that Africans were in no way passive recipients of colonisation, as many African states and rulers, such as the Ashanti, Abyssinians and Zulus, fought to resist. However, the Industrial Revolution meant that Europe had the advantage of machinery and artillery, which made it difficult for Africans to unite across the continent and resist. So what enabled the colonial process between 1450 to around 1790, and what was the impact of colonialism on Africa's underdevelopment throughout this time? The seizure of Constantinople in 1453 meant that Europe's door to the Far East was closed, and with increased European exploration, the Silk Roads went into decline because of the rise in sea trade as a result. The slave trade, which was already predominant in East Africa and practiced by the Ottomans, and slave systems developing in West Africa, enabled trade patterns to connect Europe with Africa and the Americas, joining both southern and northern hemispheres and making trade a global interaction. England's colonial model was also quite different to that of other European nations, in that it was based on a limited monarchy with some independent government structure. They were less interested in religious conversion, direct rule and expensive controlling bureaucracies, and more interested in building colonies that focused on extracting raw materials and making money. Maybe this was the reason why it was so much easier for Britain to let go of its colonies at a time of increasing African nationalism during the mid-part of the 20th century. The impact of colonialism saw drastic changes in European activities and a change in demographics and habitats across the world, where mass production of cash crops such as sugar, tea, tobacco, coffee and alcohol saw a change in eating habits, as well as human migration from Europe to America, the Caribbean, Africa and India. The Industrial Revolution also enabled Britain to take full advantage of its own large coal and iron reserves, and new inventions in farming and agriculture meant mass manufacturing in towns and cities, seeing mercantilism morph into economic investments into networks, which made its colonies more accessible to Britain without necessarily interconnecting its colonies together. The Cape to Cairo train line, presented by Henry Hamilton Johnston in 1888, was one such proposal to enable this kind of networking to happen, but it was later disregarded. However, these activities could have worked together to invest into improving Africa's infrastructure and possible political stability, but when independence arrived for these nations in the period from 1957 to 1980, it proved that neither had been achieved. So, in what way is China painting the map red. And is it breaking up the Commonwealth? Even though the US is still by far Africa's largest investor, with troops stationed in countries such as Chad, Libya and the Congo, out of the top 10 African nations who have been recipients of the largest loans from China, 6 of these are former British colonies: Zambia, Cameroon, Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe and South Africa. In recent years, China has become Africa's most dominant trading partner, accounting for around 40% of Africa's global trade, with most of China's current projects focusing on construction and mining across the continent. China is also selling its own culture, where in Guinea-Bissau many signs are displayed now in Mandarin, as well as its own currency, where 14 countries now accept the Chinese yuan as a reserve currency to enable them to repay their loans. And 8 out of these 14 countries were former British colonies: Botswana, Kenya, Lesotho, Malawi, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia and Zimbabwe. Both of these characteristics reflect colonial designs of the past 2 centuries. Since 2000, the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation has met on multiple occasions, 7 times in total, and even though investment of China dipped slightly in 2020 to take into account the pandemic, it is obvious that Africa is going through a transformation of development, and China is more than willing to put up the investment. It has been projected that by 2050, Africa will account for 1/4 of the world's population, with 60% of these being under the age of 25. With these statistics in mind, Africa's immense future potential to realise its own golden era further into the 21st century will enable many of its 54 nations to become contenders for G economies, overtaking other world economies in growth, output, trade, skilled workforce, medicine and technology. It's easy to see why the US would see Africa as an arena to confront China, as well as territory for other investors, such as Israel, Canada and India, to scramble for. But is the future bright for Africa? Or is it just a repeat of its 18th and 19th century woes? As Africa allows another foreign power to extract its vibrant and diverse diaspora, currency, culture and raw materials to manufacture and sell back to it, is all this foreign investment merely a masquerade for a debt trap? Sound familiar? If you liked this podcast, you can listen to my other podcast episodes related to this one that also explores the theme of invasion and colonisation, such as Constantinople 1453, a catalyst for European change, the Pink Map Project, The Ultimate Paradox, and the Louisiana Purchase 1803, expanded. You can also listen to my episodes Barbados, A New Republic, and Victorian Revolutionaries, which I also allude to in this episode. And finally, don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement. My Stories, or Poetic Narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. They're all available on the website in both ebook, Kindle and paperback formats. I'm working on publishing and releasing the next 4 titles, and you have a sneak peek on the website with the new book covers and learning journeys for The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, and finally, A Story for South Africa. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media. Just visit storiestobetold.com and click onto whichever social media link you'd like to follow us on. And while you're on the website, don't forget to join our mailing list, where you'll receive free samples of all 4 of our current titles. And if you choose to do so, you'll join our prize draw, where I'm in the process of giving away copies of Aspiring Authors magazine, published to celebrate this year's Black History Month in the US, where I'm a featured author. Now, I've decided to run this promotion beyond the month of February and March and continue to give away a free copy each month, right up to UK Black History Month in October, to a lucky winner on my email list. So visit the website storiestobetold.com and register for your free samples to enter the draw. As always, it is a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. I'd like to dedicate this outro to Yaroslav, a Ukrainian who is the producer of the music track for this podcast series. My prayers are with you and your loved ones at this time. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. And to everyone else, stay safe, stay well, stay blessed. Thanks so much for listening again, and I'll see you on the next page.